Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Robbie, thanks so much for having me. My name is Peter Kalliney. I am the Tuggle Chair in English and Africana and African American Studies at the University of Kentucky, where I've been teaching and doing my research since 2006.
Now, how'd you get started into interesting African American studies?
In graduate school, I primarily focused on British literature of the 20th century, and I became increasingly interested in some of the writers from the Caribbean and from sub-Saharan Africa, and to a lesser extent, the writers from Asia who were coming to the United Kingdom and publishing in British-based periodicals and appearing on literary programs, radio programs that were being broadcast on the BBC and elsewhere. And this was, of course, the great wave of decolonization. I'm talking about the 1950s and 60s, where the British Empire went from being the largest geopolitical entity in the world to being a relatively small island with still a vibrant economy, but less sway in the geopolitical sense of things. And so I became interested in this process where writers from the decolonizing world who were speaking and working in the English language were in the process of globalizing the language and turning English into a literary language that was not just being practiced in the United States or North America and the United Kingdom, but was really a medium for communication among writers from all across the world, especially writers who were coming out of colonial and former colonial areas. So that's how my research sort of developed and evolved over the years, moving from my PhD to some of the work that I've done more recently.
A lot of my focus, especially when it comes to writers, is a lot about like the politicization, I would say, like when it comes to propaganda and other aspects. I'm just curious, are some of these writings that were, being talked about, during out of these places of decolonization, were they political? Were they, any slights to certain ideas or ideologies, or were they more, historical in a sense of another area's location? I'm just curious to what some of the types of writings are.
A lot of the writing was deeply political. One of the first radio programs that I got excited about studying featured George Orwell. It was during World War II. It was broadcast on the BBC, and he invited writers, some of whom he was friends with, such as Mulkraj Anand, who's an Indian left-oriented writer, to appear on the program. And part of this was part of a broader anti-fascist effort. Orwell was trying to feature a number of writers to suggest that the British Empire was drawing on all of its resources to combat fascism. Orwell eventually quit the BBC because he was frustrated with the fact that the British government was moving very slowly on decolonization. So it was interesting. You have a period in the 1940s where a number of writers from across the British Empire are collaborating to produce anti-fascist material. But some of those alliances started to break apart in the latter part of the 1940s, when the British government was perceived by many to be dragging its heels on decolonization. Orwell was himself a very vocal critic of British imperialism, and he thought that the best way to win World War II would be to put together a united front amongst writers and intellectuals from across the British Empire to defeat Hitler and the fascist alliance, But the catch was that Orwell also believed that he had to, or the British government should be strong advocates for forming a federation or something like the Commonwealth that would be a group of federated but independent states that would come out of the remnants of the British Empire. When Orwell felt that the BBC and other government agencies were dragging their heels on that, he left, and so did a number of other writers. So some of the writing from this period was heavily political, and some of the collaborations between white British and writers from around the British Empire were certainly enabled by shared political commitments. But other writing from this period was very, I'll call it apolitical. And that's an interesting sort of feature of the writing from this period, is that you have a wide range of writers writing in the English language and circulating their materials, some of it with involving a shared political vision. Other writing from around the British Empire was deeply apolitical, you could call it, from this period.
Now, was it received like from another country like the United States or Russia? Was it received as sometimes as political propaganda in a sense? I mean, it's hard because honestly, you could pull out, I mean, you can look at any book, childhood book. You can say Clifford was a propaganda message. I don't know, because Clifford's red. You can think communism. I have no clue. But some people draw those distinctions. They think this is what an underlying factor is, especially if you overanalyze something like that. I'm just curious if any countries like the United States or Russia or anybody saw this as a threat. I mean, it's the true quote of the pen is mightier than the sword. I mean, how many people got involved that necessarily didn't want to fight in a war, but were more than happy to talk about issues and be able to display them through the art form of writing?
So it's a great question, and I should back up a little bit and say that I got interested in some of this material by looking at some of the white British writers, metropolitan writers, who were collaborating with writers from the British Empire, such as Mokraj Anand, who I mentioned, Una Marson, who was an important Jamaican poet during the 1940s and 50s. And what I gradually realized as my research developed and continued is that after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union started becoming much more active in the world of arts and letters. So I got interested, because of the work that I did on my PhD and afterwards, in this question through some of the British agencies and through some of the magazines and radio programs that were based in London. But what I gradually realized is that as I spun some of these questions forward, where I was thinking about the nexus between politics and literature, is that the United States, which had not previously been very involved before the 1950s, and the Soviet Union, which had limited involvement before the 1950s, but really stepped up their game during and after the 1950s. Because of the Cold War, these two geopolitical powers, superpowers as they came to be known during the Cold War, got very interested in arts and letters. And I can talk a little bit more about the specific programs that they launched, but increasingly, the United States and Soviet Union came to dominate in many ways the global world of arts and letters from the 1950s going forward. They were certainly interested in trying to peddle influence overseas. They were very interested in what were sometimes called the new nations of the world. During the 1950s and 60s, virtually the entire continent of Africa, which had been under European domination, became at least formally independent. If you look at a map of the continent with dates of decolonization, you see that Egypt was one of the earliest countries to earn its independence from the United Kingdom in 1952. Ghana follows in 1957. And after that, it's just a wave of decolonization across the continent, culminating with the end of apartheid and the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994. So what's interesting in historical terms is that the period of decolonization in Africa, and it's a similar story in the parts of Asia that were not part of the Soviet Union, China, India, Persia, or Iran, as it's now known, all achieving their independence from British and Japanese influence. This story of decolonization is a global movement in the 1950s and 60s, and so it corresponds in many ways historically with the high point of the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union were both very interested in what kinds of geopolitical alignments these countries would have. They used political means and military influence. The United States and Soviet Union fought many proxy wars. They intervened in civil wars and wars of independence in various ways. But they also believed that they could exert a lot of influence if they could form alliances with writers and intellectuals in the decolonizing world. And to that end, the United States and Soviet Union really stepped up what I call their cultural diplomacy efforts in the 1950s and 60s. They started sponsoring radio programs, literary prizes, book publishing, magazine publishing, and one of the things that they really did very aggressively were promote international literary conferences in Asia and Africa. And I spent a lot of time in my book, The Aesthetic Cold War, Decolonization and Global Literature, which is really the reason we're having this conversation. It was just published in fall of 2022 with Princeton University Press. I spent a lot of time in that book talking about literary conferences and other efforts that the United States and Soviet Union did to try to woo writers from, or court writers from, the decolonizing parts of the world. So that's a little bit how the story unfolds. It's really about the confluence of decolonization and the Cold War. There were, of course, lots of things that that governments did in terms of military aggression and supporting independence movements of one kind or another, fighting proxy wars, engaging in all kinds of diplomatic maneuvers to exert influence. But writers and intellectuals were also a crucial part of this story.
Do you think it's because the writers and the intellectuals had kind of a way to be able to gain the public in their own respective sources or work? Or do you think that, like, I mean, I would, if you talked about the United States wooing people over, I would only think, especially during the Cold War, was to make sure nobody fell to communism or no one was attracted to communism. And then if you look at Russia's side, were they trying to get people interested into communism? So it's like people are applying their own ways to be able to manipulate the writers. I mean, no, I don't think anybody's doing it out of the kindness of their heart. Maybe a couple people, but I think most of it's probably for political gain or be able to fit best with their ideology. And I think you're going into Cold War, no weapons are being fired, but there's intelligence stealing that's going on. There's a whole area of spying that's happening behind the works. And also writers. I mean, if you can fight a war without using weapons, but a war of words, get writers on your side, make sure that you spark up the best impression.
There are several answers to that question. So the first answer that I want to make sure that I get out there fairly early on in the conversation is that when government agencies from the US and Soviet Union were trying to court or woo writers by supporting magazines and book publishing and other ventures, they were supplementing what I call cultural diplomacy with their intelligence gathering and spy networks. So a large number of the writers that I study in this book were the beneficiaries of cultural diplomacy or state patronage when the US and Soviet Union were supporting literary conferences and prizes and magazine and book publishing and so on and so forth. But these writers were also subject to state surveillance and intimidation. There were writers who were bullied, spied upon. Many of the spy agencies that I talk about in this book took great trouble to let writers know that they were under surveillance. There were writers that I can talk about a little later in the conversation who were deported from the United States and elsewhere because of their supposed association with subversive political groups. So this isn't just a story about how the United States and Soviet Union used their influence to try to court writers and curry favor with writers. That's an important part of the story. But there were also specific forms of state discipline. In the United States, in particular, the FBI spied on a wide range of writers. And it's worth pointing out that most of these writers were people of African descent or writers that were not heterosexual, that practiced some kind of queer sexuality that made them suspicious in the eyes of the US government. The
I'm
US
smelling Hoover on that one. I'm smelling Hoover on that one.
Yeah, for sure. One of my colleagues, Bill Maxwell, who teaches at Washington University in St. Louis, has got a great book that influenced my work a lot. It's called FBIs, and the eyes is spelled like the eyes we see with. And it's a book that goes through the extensive FBI files that were collected on James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, and a whole generation of African-American writers. My book picks up that story to an extent by looking at the FBI's surveillance and intimidation of Caribbean writers, such as Claudia Jones and CLR James, who were both born in Trinidad, spent significant amount of time in the United States in the 1940s and 1950s, but were ultimately deported after lengthy FBI investigations. They both go to the United Kingdom and settle in London during the latter part of the 1950s, where MI5 picks up the story. FBI and MI5 collaborated on monitoring these writers. They shared information, and reading the intelligence dossiers that were collected by the FBI on this side of the Atlantic and MI5 on the other side of the Atlantic is a kind of interesting comparative exercise.
Are they similar at all?
Yeah, they are similar, but there are some crucial differences. One thing, and if I can share screen for a second, that I can show you that was.
I know you had to think about the ethical challenges of free writing or free expression with writing, of just influence in this. We could have went in a whole different direction if this did not go the way that it did.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're, in certain respects, we're jumping ahead to the second part of my project, which is about state surveillance of writers, which is a very interesting part of the topic. And we can circle back to some of the state patronage or cultural diplomacy that I was talking about a moment ago. But and you can see the screen, am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So I wanted to show you just one document from Claudia Jones's FBI file, which is fascinating. It's about 1,000 pages, and anybody can get it through the Freedom of Information Act. So it's about 1,000 pages in length. About between 700 and 800 pages are pages that you can actually view, because maybe a couple of hundred pages have been withheld or redacted.
Or destroyed.
It's hard to know. All I've been able to see are the photocopies of this. I haven't been able to get my hands on whatever actual paper may exist. And if
Have you came across any that were like upside down and just like unreadable, like they scanned it 1,000 times?
Yeah, so I'll show you this one from CLR James's FBI file, which is shorter in length. This shows you the quality of many of the pages and some of the heavy redactions that are in some of the pages. Some of the pages from CLR James's file had been photocopied and handled so much that they were actually very hard to read. But you've also got massive redactions. Now, one of the things that I've speculated about CLR James's file is it's worth pointing out that CLR James was not a communist. He was not a member of the Communist Party. He was actually what was at the time called a Trotskyite. And he was bitterly opposed to the influence that Stalin had in the Communist Party. He was a revolutionary, but he was not a member of the Communist Party, and he belonged to some very small, what were effectively reading groups during the 1940s, especially in the Detroit and New York areas. And what you can see with this, some of the documents is in his file, is not only have they been handled by dozens of people and bent and made hard to read through lots of contact with human hands, but you can see the kind of redactions that are here. And one of the things that I've speculated about, and it's hard to know exactly, is that he was a member of a small group that had a couple of dozen people involved. It looks as if a good number of people of that group were themselves FBI agents. And one of the reasons that you have so many redactions is because that they are trying to protect in their documents the identity of agents who are involved with the FBI. One of the things that I speculate, given the number of redactions that are in CLR James's file, is that there were probably more at certain points FBI agents that were active in some of the small groups that he was a member of than there were actual activists who were not connected with the FBI or providing information to the FBI. So I sort of have an imagination. It's hard to know because a lot of this information is protected, of small reading groups of a dozen people with any number of them actually reporting information back to the FBI. And the FBI would withhold information about other agents, right? And so one agent might be reporting on someone that he or she thinks is another subversive, but is actually just another person who's providing information to the FBI. So when you ask that question about, the status of these documents, it immediately made me think to this, where you've got a small group of political activists, many of whom are providing information to the FBI.
The FBI was very, very known for invading COINTELPRO, and that's kind of like their whole objective there, is trying to obviously spy. But I talked to John Thunheim of the AARB, who's in charge of the Assassination Records Review Board. He said one of two things that keeps documents withheld or keeps their names redacted and what can't be, I guess, unredacted. And that's if someone's name was being used who's still alive, or it's an intelligence operation that is still going on today. And that's what he left me with. And it's like, man, that can be so much. That looks like a list of names right there, just with the short redaction marks on it. But
it is. And one of the fascinating things that you can see with this doc, it may be hard to see from what you have here, but where I'm moving my cursor, that word is England. And what that means probably is that it's an informant that was connected with the British security services in some way. The other possibility is that it's an agent who was in a position to liaise with British security services and could transmit information to England.
Now, is this a United States document that we're looking at?
It is. It's if you look in this area of the document, it says United States government. It's to it's a memo written to the director of the FBI, and it's from SAC, which is Special Agent in Charge, based in Detroit. And so it's a memo from a field agent, if you like, who's based in Detroit and gathering information about one of these small political groups that CLR James was active in Detroit. And he's communicating this information to Hoover and to whoever else at the FBI is interested. But I do know, I'm not sure if I have any images from CLR James's MI5 file. Let me scroll through here really quickly. I'm sorry, I don't have any information from CLR James's MI5 file pulled up, but we do know that the FBI and MI5 coordinated and collaborated. So CLR James spent several years in England in the 1930s. So he left Trinidad, I want to say in, I don't remember exactly the year. It was around 1933 or thereabouts. And he went to England for a number of years where he was writing and politically active. But mostly he was working as a writer and scholar, studying slave revolts, as well as some of the activities of the Communist Party. And he was trying to think about where the Communist Party went wrong in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. And while he was in England, he collaborated with several people, including another Trinidadian whom he knew from his childhood, called George Padmore, who would have an interesting itinerary of his own. He ended up in Ghana as a special advisor to Kwame Nkrumah, and he was a major theorist of what would be called Pan-African politics. So CLR James and George Padmore had MI5 files collected on them in the 1930s. And then right at about the start of World War II, CLR James goes to the United States in 1939, roughly. And with the outbreak of war, he ends up staying in the United States for the next dozen years. He actually marries an American woman during his time in the United States. And during that time, when he was in the United States, his MI5 file goes more or less dormant. There are a few documents here and there that pop up, but largely his MI5 file goes dormant, and his FBI file during that period explodes, especially in the latter part of the 1940s. It's in 1947 that the FBI is really on his trail until they deport him from the country in the mid-1950s.
Was there a reason why he was deported?
Yeah, he was deported for being Black and a communist, really is the upshot of the issue. The nominal reason that they deported him was for overstaying his visa, but that was not the reason that he was actually
Kind of
deported.
trumped up charges a little bit. Like, they kind of just got a
Yeah,
way to get rid of him.
so he had overstayed his visa, but he had also registered for selective service for World War II. He was never called up. He married. He was not dodging the state's border patrol during this period, and he had actually applied to become a naturalized citizen. As I said, he'd married a woman from the United States.
Because that's what communists do, right? It just doesn't make sense.
It was only later, after some legislative changes that were passed during the 1950s, that made belonging to a communist or subversive group illegal. These things were not illegal before the 1950s, as long as the organization did not preach specifically anti-government propaganda or advocate specifically for an armed rebellion.
That sounds like it'd be a wide range, but they could label anything communist propaganda. So
Yeah, that's right. And so his deportation was something that he contested legally. He spent a good long time on Ellis Island in detention. And he was ultimately deported. In my view, he was deported because he was interested in radical politics, although he was bitterly anti-Stalinist and anti-communist, and because he was Black. I have no doubt in my mind that he would have been treated somewhat differently if he had not been a person of African descent.
can I bring up about the differences between the MI5 files and the USA files? The reason why I ask that is if he eventually his files for MI5 become cold, and the FBI's files start to go up more about him, I wonder if the FBI was thinking that it might have been like a paranoia issue between MI5 used to have this guy and now you have him. So there's kind of like, I mean, if you look at the intelligence communities and kind of look at just the way the world works, every country's got like a gun pointed to each other's head, just waiting for someone to pull the freaking trigger. So I wonder, there's a thing in intelligence services called going native. And one of the issues with going native when you're in another country is the fact that they try and rotate you out every couple of years to make sure. I'm not saying he was an agent. I'm just saying when you have someone involved in some type of overseas event, you give them a couple of years, then you keep rotating them out to make sure that they don't become native to where they're staying or they're doing their operation. And getting married is an issue. Certain things like that are seen as giant red flags that you end up becoming more of an issue. So if the MI5 had the same kind of idea that maybe he'd be going native in the United States, it's now the United States. Are they going to weaponize? Not weaponize as in using his work for their own gain and losing contact with the MI5. I mean, that's, like I said, another paranoia issue, which FBI would see that as a problem and they would find any way to just get rid of it and not deal with the escalation with MI5 or any of the British Secret Services.
Yeah, excellent question. So there certainly were some rivalries during this period, and I'm not an intelligence expert. I really should make that clear. I got interested in this question because of my interest in writers. And so to the extent that I know a little bit about the security services, it's primarily funneled through my interest in how these agencies dealt with writers. And so in the case of the writers that I happen to study and be interested in, there actually is very little evidence of rivalry between, let's say, MI5 and the FBI in these instances. They seem to collaborate pretty well on the case of CLR James and Claudia Jones. So for instance, with CLR James's file, the MI5 file goes pretty quiet during the latter part of the 1940s and early part of the 1950s. But when he's deported, when James is deported in 1953, I believe, the MI file, boom, springs back to life immediately. And in fact, MI5 has somebody on the boat. So when CLR James is deported, he leaves from New York and he decides not to repatriate to Trinidad, but to go to London, where he had spent time in the 1930s. And MI5 has got somebody on the boat who is providing a report, and actually gets kind of friendly with CLR James on the ride from New York to England and has several conversations with him. It's clear from the report that's filed. This is only likely to be possible if the FBI and MI5 are trading a certain amount of information during this period. Now, it certainly makes sense that the FBI wanted figures like CLR James off U.S. soil. And this is true with both CLR James and with Claudia Jones. So if I can show you another image, an interesting image here from Claudia Jones's FBI file, which is much more extensive than CLR James's. I've got an image taken from one of the earlier documents in her file, and it's called a prosecutive summary. So about 50 pages of of Claudia Jones's file. The first 50 or 100 pages of her file are the FBI kind of getting to know her. They're trying to figure out exactly where is this woman from. For a while, they thought she was from Virginia. And it took them a while to figure out that she was actually from Trinidad. And eventually they figure out she came to Trinidad with her parents when she was 9 years old, and she lived in New York since then. They're trying to figure out if Claudia, her maiden name was Claudia Cumberbatch, if the name Claudia Jones is an alias or if it's actually her real name.
Is your favorite color red? Do you happen to support communism?
They're trying to figure out all this stuff. So that's about the first, 50 or 100 pages of the file. But soon after that, the FBI are assembling these documents called prosecutive summaries, where they have not arrested this person, they have not charged this person for a crime, but they are preparing for an extensive prosecution. And they start to put together documents. And this is a document taken from one of those prosecutive summaries, which could be very extensive. The lengthiest one in her file, keep in mind that it's about an 800-page file that you can read. One of these documents is 111 pages long, right? So these are massive documents assembling all the evidence against these people. Now, before I had looked at an FBI file, I thought, okay, there's going to be all kinds of information from secret sources, from agents in the field who are listening to private conversations. There's going to be information from wiretaps. There's going to be all kinds of spycraft in this file. The most fascinating thing about Claudia Jones's file is that the vast majority of the information is not taken from any of these sources, but is in fact gathered from libraries. And in the prosecutive summaries that the FBI collected or gathered or produced on Claudia Jones, the star witnesses were not going to be confidential agents who were providing information about Claudia Jones, but they were going to be librarians. The star witness here in this document is the librarian of the New York Public Library, who was envisioned to come into court and present a series of articles that Claudia Jones had written for various communist publications. So, one of the fascinating things about these files is that the intelligence community worked in some very interesting ways. They often worked more like librarians and researchers. A lot of the research that they did is similar to the kinds of research that I did for my PhD in literature. And a lot less of this was, what you sort of imagine from a James Bond film. So that's one of the kind of fascinating things that I found about the intelligence files that were gathered on these different writers. And I want to circle back to the question that you asked me, which is about differences between the MI5 and FBI. One of the key differences between the way these agencies worked and dealt with writers and intellectuals from the Caribbean, from sub-Saharan Africa, from other parts of Asia, is that the MI5 and FBI had different, I'll call them political relationships with these writers. The United States wanted these figures to the extent that they could out of the United States. One of the ways that the United States dealt with what they thought of as subversive aliens is get them out of the country at all costs and as expeditiously and quickly as possible. Put them in jail. Both Claudia Jones and CLR James spent time at Ellis Island awaiting the conclusion of their prosecution. Claudia Jones actually spent a year in a penitentiary in West Virginia. When she finished her service, she was turfed out of the country right away. So the FBI wanted these figures out of the country if there was another country that was willing to take them. And they communicated with the diplomatic services and the State Department, their counterparts in the United Kingdom, saying, listen, these people are citizens of the United Kingdom. We want them out. Will you take them? And the answer that they got was yes, they have the right to come home or to come back to UK territories if they want to. Now, what's interesting is that when the United Kingdom was confronted with these choices, they did not want Claudia Jones or CLR James, or in the case of Doris Lessing, another writer that I talk about extensively who was spied on by MI5. She's a woman who was born in what was then Rhodesia and what later became Zimbabwe after a war of independence. They did not want these writers going to Trinidad or Zimbabwe. They wanted them coming to London if they could. And the theory, if you want to put it that way, was relatively simple. If these people were subversives, we want them out of colonial areas where they might cause all kinds of trouble. And we want them in London, where we can keep a close eye on them. Now, they had security services in Jamaica and in Trinidad, throughout the Caribbean, throughout Africa as well. And there's a lot of correspondence and interaction between MI5 and their counterparts in South Africa and Rhodesia, as it was then known in the case of Doris Lessing. These security services led by the MI5 did not want these people anywhere in colonial territories where they might supposedly cause trouble. They wanted them in London, where these people could be absorbed as harmless, eccentric, with radical views on politics, but where they weren't likely to cause all that much trouble. Or
they were treating it like a disease is what they were doing.
Yeah, sorry, say that again.
They were treating it like a disease is what they were doing.
Yeah, they were treating it like a disease, like an eccentricity, where in the United Kingdom, in metropolitan London, this was a place where these writers could be kept tabs on and otherwise left to go about their business. In England, these people could say and do whatever they wanted. They could go to Speaker's Corner and shout at the top of their lungs if they wanted to. They could publish whatever kind of subversive stuff they wanted to in England, as long as they were kept out of the colonies where anti-colonial agitation was starting to reach a fever pitch in the 1960s and 70s. In Rhodesia, where there was a version of apartheid called the color bar, the MI5 wanted to keep Doris Lessing, who was white, but who was a very active opponent of racism and the color bar. They wanted to keep her out of Rhodesia, where she could find a sympathetic audience among Black Rhodesians. They wanted to keep her in London. So that was one of the key differences in attitude between the FBI and MI5. FBI wanted to prosecute, put people in jail, and if possible, get these people out of the way and out of the country. MI5 was happy to listen and watch and keep extensive files to make sure that these people didn't get into trouble. But what they really wanted to do is keep these people out of colonial areas where it was where they were concerned that they could start anti-colonial revolutions, or at least become involved in anti-colonial revolutions.
It gives you a better perspective on just the mindsets of what these agencies are doing. I mean, if you're willing to persecute people right off the back, basically, I mean, that shows you a lot about our FBI. It was very good at getting rid of people in that sense. But then you see the MI5 is just watching things unfold, as long as it's not influencing anybody else around. I mean, they're looking at it from more of like an observation aspect of things, which I mean can be equally as damaging. But you know, the FBI tended to go a little bit overboard in most of the things they started doing when it came to persecuting people. So
MI5 preferred, I think, the strategy of containment. Now, the United States certainly practiced this as well. One of my colleagues here at the University of Kentucky, Alan Nadell, has written a celebrated book on containment culture and the United States. So it's not a concept that was alien to the United States, but I think it was practiced actually much more effectively in the United Kingdom, where they felt that Marxists and communists and other kinds of people with radical political views could be contained much more effectively if they were allowed to say whatever they wanted to, as long as they didn't raise arms against the government. The UK certainly drew the line there, you know, and this is a country that when, you know, going back, and they took great pride in this, when Karl Marx was kicked off the continent, when he was hounded out of Germany and elsewhere, he found refuge in London. And you know, he wrote his 2.5 volumes of Capital there, and he did his research at the British Library. The United Kingdom was a place where many anarchists during the early part of the 20th century and latter part of the 19th century found refuge when they had been hounded out of France and Italy and Germany and other places on the continent. So the United Kingdom long prided itself on its relative tolerance. Now that tolerance extended only so far. If you were a radical who was operating in Jamaica or Trinidad or in Rhodesia or Ghana or Kenya, they were keeping close eyes on exactly what you were doing. And if you were too troublesome, they would certainly put you in jail. A lot of the leading anti-colonial leaders, the whole generation of independence leaders in Africa in the 1960s, most of them had spent time in jail during the 40s and 50s.
When it comes to some of these subversives, were the places that they were getting these subversives from, some of the writers, were their countries aware of a lot of this influence and a lot of this kind of, I wouldn't say patronage of, the agencies, but I mean, at least a lot of the spying and kind of tactics that they're using to basically take advantage of these writers? Like, when did that become public knowledge compared to when we started getting documents on a lot of this stuff?
Yeah, excellent question. So the documents tend to come much later. MI5 released, if I'm not mistaken, the Doris Lessing file when she died in, I want to say 2012. Don't quote me on that date. I need to go back and check it again. So Doris Lessing, her extensive MI5 files were not released until after her death, if I'm not mistaken. But she knew that she was being watched throughout the late 1940s and 50s and 60s, and she talks about it in her writing. She was very aware of the fact that she was being monitored, especially so she's born in Rhodesia. She comes to England in late 1949 or early 1950, and she makes her first trip back to Rhodesia in 1957. And she was supposed to go there with the blessing of TASS, the Soviet news agency, and write a book or report. Now, she incidentally fell out with the Communist Party during that period. This is the time when Khrushchev's special speech or secret speech is made known to the world, when they admit some of the atrocities that happened during Stalin's reign. It's also during the uprising in Hungary, when Soviet tanks clamped down on dissident Hungarians. And Doris Lessing, who is a communist, says, right, I want nothing more to do with the Communist Party. But when she first goes back to Rhodesia in 1956, 1957, she's going there to supposedly write a book for TASS on the color bar and on what was then called the federation that was being created between Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and what's now Malawi. So she was going to write a report on colonial conditions and racism in this part of the country. Well, as soon as she shows up in Rhodesia, she knows that her luggage is being opened. She's being tailed by the police. And this is very obvious because it's a country with a fairly small white minority. And of course, all the police that are following her are white. And she writes in her book about that journey that she could smell the political police miles away before she could even see them. It was very easy to spot them during her travels in Rhodesia. And so what's interesting about doing this research is that Lessing writes very openly and angrily in many ways about the fact that she was being monitored throughout her experience there. I think she knew she was being monitored in London as well when she returned there. But later in her career, in her autobiography, which is published in the early 2000s, she says, yeah, I always knew that I was being watched by MI5. But my brushes with the infamous MI or the famous MI5 have always been rather brief. So later on in her life, she ended up downplaying the extent to which she was surveilled by MI5. But if you go back to the things that she wrote during the 1950s, she knew that she was under surveillance. She went on a trip to the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. She was part of the first post-war World War II delegation of writers, British writers, to go from England to the Soviet Union. And MI5 picked up that trail and kept an eye on her when she was there. And she was not naive. She knew that she was under surveillance. But later in her life, she sort of downplayed it. But at the time it was happening, she absolutely knew what was happening and exactly why it was happening.
Did she ever think that any of these spying tactics led to maybe any of her success being limited? I know there's a large amount of that when people are, either you can look at the Hollywood 10, the blacklist, or anything like that. I mean, having communist views or having some things that could be labeled communist, which seems like everything back then could have been labeled being communist. Even if you drank water, you're a communist. But
Yeah.
that limits your growth. And I feel like as a person, if somebody was spying on me and I did something where someone was just surveilling me and I knew about it, I would feel like my growth was being limited in a sense, whether it was my viewpoints or I feel like I had to maybe self-censor in a sense. I mean, the suppression aspect. And also, I mean, were they reading her mail? Were they doing any of these things to an extent to be able to monitor? So you got to be careful what now you're writing and what you're going to be talking about. You can't really have such, I guess, passionate voice when you're being kind of censored. I wouldn't say censored, but surveilled at least.
Yeah, it's Lessing is a very particular case. And her case is illustrative of, again, some of the differences between what the FBI were doing to what the people that were considered subversives in the United States and what MI5 were doing to people who were considered subversives in the United Kingdom. MI5 took very good care to read everything that she wrote, but they never censored her work. And Lessing, who was perverse in a lot of ways, I'm not talking sexually perverse, but in her sort of obstinate mindset, she took it as a sign of her own importance in many ways that the MI5 were keeping tabs on her. She felt that she must be doing something right if she were considered dangerous enough for MI5 to keep track of what she was doing. And in the chapter that I talk about Doris Lessing extensively, I actually make the argument that as Lessing's career develops, she certainly saw the MI5 as something that could limit intellectual work. But she also took the MI5 and their surveillance tactics as a source of inspiration. She started out her career as a pretty conventional writer, writing highly realist stories, and she eventually became much more experimental. She got interested in science fiction and what might be called speculative fiction nowadays. She got interested in Islamic Sufism, which is a branch of Islamic mysticism. She got really interested in telepathy as well. She believed that people had access to paranormal abilities that conventional society was allowing or forcing them to suppress. And in some of her later writing, which has been categorized as science fiction or what she called space fiction, people start to develop all kinds of paranormal abilities that are quite striking. They start to be able to communicate with people in far-flung areas of the world. They start to be able to read and listen to what other people were thinking without them having to articulate any of their views verbally. Lessing starts to develop a model for human development based on surveillance and surveillance networks. And in some of her later fiction, she starts to pit what are what are the conventional intelligence services that we think about, MI5, FBI, CIA, all their kind of monitoring apparatus. And she suggests that the only way to defeat that is for human beings to develop their special powers of telepathy and ways of intuiting or predicting the future. She thinks that human beings, the only way they're going to defeat this oppressive apparatus of the security services is not actually to resist them, but in many ways to mimic them. So Doris Lessing was kind of nutty.
Well, our government did that as well too. I mean, that's a whole movie, Men Who Stared Goats. It's based on Project Hero and a bunch of things where they were trying to create psychological warriors. It was this really, really bad info that a spy got from the Soviet Union talking about Russia was creating psychological warriors. And I could show you plenty of documentation where they're talking about like gateway experience, holograms, the temporal experience with your brain and connecting consciousness. And it's like you're looking at a government document like, oh my God, I'm smelling patchouli oil. And this is like every single like horoscope store I've ever been in with the weird writings on the walls, and our government's talking about it, which is just interesting to me. I mean, remote viewing was a large thing that they tried to do in many tactics and warfare as well too. But I mean, during the Cold War, everybody was trying everything to be able to find some advantage, and they went deep into that psychological super soldier route.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in Doris Lessing, she's got a very, very lengthy 5-volume novel series called Children of Violence, and it's a very long read. It's a couple thousand pages. Each novel is 500-600 pages long, and for the first 4.5 volumes, it is a very conventional realist story. It tells the story of a woman who seems to resemble Doris Lessing in all kinds of ways. But the last half of the last novel in that series just completely goes off the rails. There's a sort of nuclear holocaust that happens, and the novel actually it culminates with a kind of war, if you like, between the intelligence services on one side, who are involved in a race to harness ESP and all kinds of paranormal experiences, and on the other side, there are people like Lessing and a bunch of people who look kind of like what we would call today hippies, who are interested in ESP and paranormal experiences to defeat what the security services are doing. So Lessing bought into a lot of these narratives that were being propagated on both sides of this security apparatus. There were people who wanted to beef up security services by exploring all of these paranormal experiences that humans may or may not be able to access. And then there were other people like Doris Lessing, very, very unconventional thinkers, who said, the way to defeat these oppressive security services that are hounding communists and hounding anti-racists such as herself was not to write books just speaking out against them and not to do just political organizing against them, but to actually harness some of these political powers that would be able to outmaneuver the political police. So it's a kind of, I think it's kind of a wacky way that she ends up pursuing her thinking about the security services. But to sort of circle back to the question you originally asked me that got us down this rabbit hole was, did the security services negatively impact the development of writers in Africa and elsewhere? The short answer is yes, absolutely. We'll never know how many novels and poems and plays were never written. There was a whole generation of writers, many of whom spent time in prison. I talk in other parts of the book about figures such as Wole Soyinka and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ruth First, who is a South African activist who was first exiled from the country, and then she was later assassinated by the South African secret police. There was no question that the attentions of the political police negatively impacted a large group of writers who were working during this period. But on the flip side, there are also some interesting and in certain ways bizarre writers, such as Doris Lessing, who took it as a kind of badge of honor that they were being monitored by MI5 and used it in a weird way to enhance their careers and open themselves up to new kinds of creativity that they might not have stumbled upon otherwise. So it's a kind of complicated, multifaceted answer that I offer in this book to what's the effect of surveillance on writers.
Look, it would be a bragging right if the FBI was spying on me, as long as they don't make my brakes go out. All right, that's all I'm saying. But I appreciate the research that you put in to make your book as well too, and I'm hoping, obviously, people listening can be able to find it as well too. But is there a place where people can find your links? Any Twitter, social media handles, anything else, website?
Yeah, so my book is called The Aesthetic Cold War, Decolonization and Global Literature. That's the subtitle. It was published by Princeton University Press in fall 2022, so just a couple months ago in October. It's widely available on Amazon. You can get it from the Princeton University Press website as well if you want to direct order from them. My writing appears in Times Literary Supplement. I have an essay that appeared at the end of September in Times Literary Supplement on Soviet cultural diplomacy initiatives, which we didn't talk about that much today, but they're fascinating in their own right. And that's also available on my own website, which is very easy to find if you Google my name, Peter Kalliney, Kalliney, at the University of Kentucky. My website pops right up, and I've got links to a lot of my publications. And so it's, because I work at an institution of higher education, it's not hard to find me and some links to some of the things that I've written.
And I'm going to link it all in the description. Peter, I do appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.